this working? Can you hear me? Okay. So we'll be taking a little bit of a detour. We could take a detour into heavy metal music. And today right now we're going to be taking a detour into more graphic design, especially for books. The theme of the conference, Type Legacies, Honoring the Heritage, Designing Type today. For this particular talk, we are honoring the legacies of book layouts and talking about what to do today. One of the things that I've found kind of interesting is that just like with variable fonts, things become more dynamic. And on the web, things are becoming more dynamic. And with digital books, things are becoming more dynamic. And as things become more dynamic, the designer has to take more of a sort of an abstract role. They can't oversee and control everything that may be done with their designs. Anyway, so I'm going to talk about how the Amazon Kindle is trying to maintain the author's intent and maximize readability under the constraints opposed by digital books, dynamic systems. So specifically, it's going to be digital books. So I could have called this talk Guardrails for Book Designs. Both guardrails and safety nets can prevent accidents. Guardrails might stop you from driving off the road. Safety nets can catch you after you've already driven off. I'm going to be talking about a couple different kinds of protections that we use to keep us out of ugly spaces. So just to begin with some examples. So here's a particular page. It looks perfectly reasonable at this point size. If you make the point size just one step larger, the title and that graphic overlap. That's kind of a collision. Another example, you might look at this and say, oh, that's not centered. The reality is this is not the way the page looked. Actually, the page looked like that. This is because this headline, the author or the publisher marked the headline as not hyphenatable. So if you mark something as not hyphenatable and you put it on a screen that's too narrow, this is what would happen. So then there's also the case, and this is really common in nonfiction, where the caption and the figure get separated, become unhitched. So if variable fonts, I was thinking of variable fonts as being a way to project a multi-dimensional object into maybe two spaces. And in a similar way, digital book publishing is a flattening of a multi-dimensional design space of layouts for a particular book into a two-dimensional view. And we can't necessarily control all of those views. So for example, unfortunately, this particular layout I think is pretty ugly. The drop cap's bad, the spacing's bad. On the right view, you can see there's a footnote marker on its own. All of those things are pretty ugly. In 1928, Aldous Huxley wrote in the Introduction to Printing of Today, "Good printing cannot make a bad book good, nor bad printing ruin a good book, but good printing can create a valuable spiritual state in the reader, bad printing a certain spiritual discomfort." This may be very similar to the spirit of typeface design that Sakamoto-san was talking about earlier. The spiritual discomfort with digital books, I think, is familiar to many, and they might reject digital books, saying, oh, I prefer print books. And I think this is similar to the discomfort that Huxley was reporting in 1928 about the new, poorly printed books of the time. So this particular essay I find very interesting. Huxley continues, "The problem which confronts the contemporary printer may be briefly stated as follows. To produce beautiful and modern print patterns," that's sort of the way he talked about typography, "by means of labor-saving machinery, this prejudice in favor," and then so he's criticizing some of the conservative forces at the time, "this prejudice in favor of handwork and ancient decorative forms was the result of an inevitable reaction against the soulless ugliness of 19th century industrialism. Machines were producing beastliness. It was only natural that sensitive people should have wished to abandon the use of machines and to return to the artistic conventions in vogue before the development of machinery. It has become obvious that the machine is here to stay, so we can use the word computer there, perhaps. And then later in the essay, machines exist. Let us then exploit them to create beauty, a modern beauty, while we are about it, for we live in the 20th century. Let us frankly admit it, and not pretend that we live in the 15th. So this, by the way, is from a really great collection of essays by Paul Bennett, and I asked, and I don't think they have a copy here today, but he's actually reacting to linotype and the development of that style of printing. It's, and the way I feel like I can maybe help to improve printing today is because of my background. I started Aldous in 1991. I worked on PageMaker 5 a little tiny bit, and then I was on the rewrite of PageMaker, which became InDesign, so I helped ship 1.0 and the rest of these. I was on the team until CS5, and I helped with the Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Middle Eastern versions. After 15 years, I worked on Muse for a little while and left to help Amazon with the Kindle layout system. I left in 2011. So I've sort of looked at it from, that's the graphic. I sort of looked at it from the one side, the printing side at Adobe, and then now in the digital side at Kindle. So if I compare the two things, InDesign is a design tool, or maybe even a set of tools that we use to produce print documents. And the general purpose of a professional tool is to be very powerful, clear to use, but the main thing is power generally wins out over ease. So some of the professional or some of these are difficult to use tools that I did in InDesign are listed there. I'm not going to read them. So if we have a powerful tool like InDesign, how do we avoid problems? What are the safety nets or guardrails that we put in place in a program like this? The reality is we didn't really build any, and we didn't feel like we needed to. Because professional designers, professional users of these tools, you don't put up guardrails, not artificially anyway, because you don't know what people want to do. And even if they do something that's especially ugly, that's their right, and it's an experiment that might help them to discover something that's beautiful. So I would argue that professional tools don't have guardrails and don't need them. And so the person who would be responsible for not producing ugliness would be a designer. In fact, they would be defining that term themselves. An alternative approach, when you have a system where you don't need or you don't have the luxury of designers for every page, like newspapers or magazines, would be a structured design system. So that's kind of like guardrails. So you create a structured design system, you put it in place, and then that helps prevent things that look bad from occurring as you produce these magazines or these newspapers. So, but what do we do with digital books? Because there's no designer, and there's also no real structured design system either. So and that's producing a certain amount of ugliness. And these days, we're looking at more like devices like this than the Kindle itself. So how does publishing happen in this particular case at Amazon? So the author submits a manuscript. The manuscript, most of the manuscripts that we get are coming in as EPUBs. And a few of the stuff that's coming through the self-published wing would come in a different path. But most everything we get comes in as EPUB. And then we put the EPUB through a conversion and standardization process that puts up some of these guardrails. So here's some examples of the guardrails that we can put up at this time. We do standardization, font size, font, page margins, line height, and alignment. So that the publisher can specify a font, that's fine. They can embed it in the book. Well, that's fine, we'll totally respect it, but they're not allowed to define the font size of the body. So the reason for that is, here's the control panel on, I think this was from my Android phone. The font, the margins, the font size, the line spacing, and the alignment are actually, the power is given to the reader to control a lot of those things. So although you can say you want a paragraph to be center aligned, and we will respect that, if you say you want a paragraph to be justified, we actually allow the reader to override that if they want. I'm not particularly a fan of that. But, and then font size, for example, for the body size, the reader defines the size. We don't let the designer define the size. So these are some of the standardizations we sort of have to do in order to give control to the reader. Some of the other ones we do, margins that when the book comes in, the margins might be specified at a fixed size, and that doesn't work very well on a different size device. So we will standardize the measurements on margins and indents. We also standardize things like blank lines. I have an example of this coming up. And non-breaking spaces, for example, early in the development, I'll go back. So we saw a book where almost every paragraph, 90% of the spaces were non-breaking. And we looked carefully at it, and however they had produced this document, they had non-breaking spaces for the entire line, an entire line, and then they had a normal space, and then that would continue for the entire paragraph. So it was designed to be set at a particular size, so that doesn't work on digital devices. So we basically set a rule that said, if there's a small number of non-breaking spaces, we honor them. If there's a very large number of non-breaking spaces, we forget them all. We get rid of them all at this standardization time. So those kinds of things are kind of difficult to explain. So here's an example where this isn't just a generic EPUB render. This particular book is not especially attractive, but that indent may be specified as 62 points or some number of points. And then if you put it on a narrower device, it gets really bad. And with phones, those narrower devices are becoming more common. So during the standardization time, we turn things like this into percentages. So anything that's above some threshold will be specified as a percent rather than a fixed measurement. This is just sort of these guardrails. We're not going to get it right all the time. Another example is this chapter start or section start. The way it was specified was as 6 blank lines. And so if you make the point size bigger, there's 6 blank lines. But probably the graphic designer was more specifying this as start the text in the middle of the page. And we still don't do a very good job of identifying those kinds of details. But that's the trying to interpret intent out of some measurements. Some other examples are color contrast. We force color contrast of a certain level at this standardization time. For example, this pink color is too light, and so we darken it. You can also imagine on a black and white device. We also do some things with footnotes. The way it's specified in an EPUB would be, there's a link, I circled them in red, and they link to another page, like this page, and then the 220 on this page links back. And so by recognizing that circularity, we can create some markup internally that we'll do to pop up the footnote on the same page. It's just another example of the kind of standardization we'll do at this time. But a bunch of so they'll call those guardrails. And then now this part is the safety nets. So safety net types of things is once we have a book and we have a bunch of the reader's choices and we have a layout engine for a particular device, and so we're producing some sort of lines. And at this time is where the safety nets come in. We try to detect some ugliness, and we try to handle it. But the critical thing, and I've heard people say, this is how designers generally think, I think, is that it doesn't really matter what device you're on. So I had some numbers, pixels, DPIs, actual sizes, whatever. What's really important is it's thinking that it's all relative, and the thing in a book is that it's relative to the body size. So you can have a page like this, which looks reasonably good. This is at a point size. But you increase the point size a little bit, and you get a layout like this. This isn't quite so nice. You can see that on the page on the left, they had put in hard breaks to create a nice rag or nice shape for the subhead, and that forced break after scattered kind of makes it look bad. Kind of hard to for designers to predict what's going to happen because you don't get control over things like that very well. So the idea is that the one on the left could be a phone at a really small size, or it could be a tablet. The one on the right could also be a phone at a larger size, or it could be a tablet at a very large size. When you think about digital reading, a larger proportion than you might imagine are being read at large point sizes because those are the people who can't read books that you would buy, the standard books that you would buy, but they can read them on the Kindle at a large size. So we always are checking to see what things look like at rather extreme sizes, just because some people have to read that way. But in general, the important thing is not what the screen size is or the DPI or the font size, because the reader's controlling that. The most important thing is the body size, the width of the device and the body size. So if a particular screen is 21 ems, in this particular example, wide, then you can guesstimate how many characters would fit. And obviously this depends on the font and the language and the script and all these other things. But we basically make a guess because, or approximation, because it doesn't matter how precise you get, you can't get it right anyway. But then we make decisions based on that. So for example, this was from my phone. Here's a particular paragraph. If I make the point size larger, we will not justify it. We will turn off justifications at a certain size. I was encouraged to create a rendering of this right page with the word spacing in place so you could see how bad it is. I would have had to do it by hand, and I just decided I could not. So anyway, you'll have to imagine that much white space distributed. But you can count the number of spaces on the lines, and you can see that the number of spaces on the lines, it's 2 or 3. So it's just not enough to do a very nice justified text. So we go ragged on purpose. Again, the point where that happens may not be right sometimes. Another example is some of the safety nets we put in place. Here's a table of contents page. The right page is on the Kindle and the left page is an EPUB reader. It looks like a table of contents. What you can't tell is that this is actually being specified as a table. So when we were doing table layouts, we discovered that some of these tables that we were dealing with were actually being used for layout purposes. And we added some special casing to recognize that. And when the table is being used for layout purposes, we can do what we call here stacked cells. So we're taking and you can see what happens if you don't do that on the right. So we recognize that particular case, and we take the left cell and we stack it over the right cell that we then indent. So obviously it doesn't work if you have more than a couple columns. Like I think 3 is our limit, but it was helping quite a bit in certain cases. It's just a safety net to try to prevent ugliness. Another thing that we'll do is with drop caps. So this particular book specifies a 4-line drop cap, but we felt like they would get on a small screen or at a large point size, they would be too dominant. And this is again, I don't know if I did it right all the time. I was trying. So if you increase the point size, I don't know why there's a blank one there. Anyway, when you increase the point size then the text got pushed to the next page. The title page is still there, and we've reduced it to 3. Increase the point size more, you'll actually get a 2-line drop cap. If you go to an extreme size, we actually remove the drop cap completely. So, I'm not sure if that's the best thing to do, but that's what we did. Another example that's kind of interesting is floating elements. You won't see very many floating elements in digital books, especially floating text elements like this. So here's an example. This is the same book, but with a slightly different point size. Let's see, so we can go back. You can see that this float is anchored at the paragraph. The quote starts with my mother, the paragraph starts with my mother. If over here my mother is near the bottom of the screen, rather than create a float that breaks across the 2 pages, which is what HTML or EPUB readers will do, we push the whole quote to the next page. It doesn't always work, but it's not always the right decision, but we felt like it was the predominantly the right decision. So we'll do this. If you keep increasing the point size, we will turn it into a block. Some of the EPUBs we get try to use media queries in CSS to do this kind of thing. We have it hard-coded. So I showed you some of the ways that we're trying to make digital books less ugly by putting in these guardrails and these safety nets. Definitely not perfect. But similar to what Huxley described in 1928, we're going through a period of transition, and I would say a transition to more dynamic graphic design. And we are working on getting this new technology improving the quality. These particular examples that I talked about here apply to nearly all books. I didn't have time to talk about special cases like Kindle in Motion books that some of you might be familiar with. We produced about 20, but they didn't really take off like we thought, but they're kind of cool. Lots more work to be done. Here's some screenshots from Kindle in Motion books. And stay tuned as we try to improve things. Thank you.